They say retirement is a fresh start, a new chapter, a clean slate in a place with better weather and lower property taxes and everything you couldn't have while the job was running your life. And for some people, that is exactly what it is. But there is another version of that story, the one nobody puts in the brochure, where the moving truck arrives and the boxes get unpacked, and the house is fine, and the neighborhood is fine, and the weather is exactly what you were promised. And somewhere around week 6, you are standing in a grocery store in a town you chose deliberately, and you realize you do not know one single person in that building. Not one. And you haven't. Not once. In 6 weeks. And the feeling that comes with that realization is not grief exactly, not panic exactly. It is the specific, quiet vertigo of someone who asked geography to answer a question that geography was never equipped to answer. My name is Linda Calloway, and what I make here is for women who refuse to accept that full speed and full stop are the only two options. If something in those first few sentences landed somewhere honest, subscribe and hit the bell. The conversations that happen here are worth being part of. And before we go any further, if you have made the retirement move or you are considering it, I want you to write in the comments one thing you are quietly afraid you might not be able to take with you. Something that isn't on any list. Just write it. You don't have to explain it. Take one breath. Because what I'm about to share is the version of this story that most retirement content keeps very quiet. 6 weeks after we moved, I was standing in a grocery store in a town I had chosen, that I had researched, that made complete sense on paper, and I realized I did not know one single person in that building. 6 weeks after we moved, I was standing in a grocery store in a town I had chosen, that I had researched, that made complete sense on paper. And I realized I did not know one single person in that building. Not one. I hadn't known one in the checkout line, hadn't recognized one in the parking lot, hadn't passed one in the cereal aisle who looked up and gave me the small nod you give to someone you've seen before. Not once. In 6 weeks. Now, I want you to understand something about that moment. It didn't feel dramatic. It wasn't a breakdown in the bread section. It was quieter than that. It was the specific low-grade vertigo of standing in a completely ordinary place and realizing that the ordinary has been reset, that the entire web of unremarkable human familiarity that I had been embedded in for 30 years, the neighbor who waves from the driveway, the pharmacist who knows my last name without asking, the woman at the dry cleaner who once said to me, completely unprompted, that she liked my haircut. All of it was gone. And I was in a perfectly acceptable grocery store, in a perfectly acceptable town that we had chosen deliberately, and I did not know one single person in the building. I drove home and I did not say anything to Tom about it, because what would I say? We had moved. We had planned this. We had spreadsheets. I want to talk today about what happens when the retirement move goes wrong. Not the dramatic version, not the couple who loses everything and has to move back in with their adult children. The quieter version, the version where nothing has gone catastrophically wrong, where the house is fine and the neighborhood is safe and the weather is better and the numbers worked out, and you are standing in a grocery store 6 weeks in and something is deeply, quietly wrong, and you don't quite have language for it yet. Because here is what I have found. The people who live this, the couples who make the move and discover somewhere in the first year that they have made a mistake, they are almost never the people who made an impulsive decision. They are almost always the people who made a careful one. They did the research. They visited. They made the spreadsheet. They asked the right questions about property taxes and proximity to the airport and the quality of the hospitals. They asked every sensible question except the one that would have actually helped them, which I'll get to, but not yet. How many of you know exactly what I'm describing? How many of you are living it right now? The move that seemed right and doesn't feel right. The town that looked like freedom and feels like dislocation. And the specific embarrassment of not knowing what to do about it because you chose this. How many of you have said, "It's fine, we're still settling in," past the point where you believed it? How many of you have watched your spouse move through a town where they don't know anyone and recognize something in their face that you didn't have a name for? And for those of you who haven't moved yet, how many of you are thinking about it? How many of you have the spreadsheet half built? How many of you have said, at least once, "If we could just get to somewhere with better weather," or "If we could just get closer to the grandkids," or "If we could just get to a lower cost of living," as if the problem you are carrying will stay behind when the moving truck leaves. I spent 27 years in human resources watching people navigate transitions. I watched people leave jobs, leave careers, leave entire professional identities. And the thing I learned, the thing I saw play out so many times that it became almost predictable, is that the most difficult transitions are not the ones where everything goes wrong. They are the ones where everything goes according to plan, and the plan turns out to have been solving the wrong problem. The retirement move is that, for many people, more than anyone talks about. I know a woman, her name was Diane. She worked in administration at the healthcare system where I spent my last 9 years. And she was one of the most organized, capable people I knew in that building. Diane retired 2 years before I did. And she and her husband moved within 3 months of her retirement. The Carolinas. They had researched it thoroughly. She sent me pictures. The porch, the light, the cost of the house compared to what they'd sold. Everything looked exactly like the brochure version of a retirement decision done well. I called Diane about 1.5 years later. I was trying to reach her about something entirely unrelated, a mutual friend's birthday, and her voice was different. Not sad, not unhappy, quieter. Like someone who has been performing adequately for a long time and has stopped noticing that they're performing. We talked for a while, and eventually I asked, because I was me, and I'd spent a career asking people things they weren't sure they wanted to answer, "How is it, really?" And she said, "It's fine. It's really fine." I filed that away, that particular fine, because I had heard that fine before, in offices, in HR meetings, from people who were not fine and had not yet given themselves permission to say so. I heard it, and I didn't know what to do with it at the time. It came back to me later. It comes back to me still. What Diane had built over 30 years of living in one place was not a house. It was not a neighborhood, not a school district, not a commute. It was a social architecture, the specific, invisible, unremarkable web of human connection that accumulates when you live somewhere long enough. The neighbor who waves, the doctor who knows that you had a difficult year in 2016 and asks about it. The people at the coffee shop where you have been going for 11 years, who know your order, who say your name. The friend from book club who texts you on a Tuesday for no reason. None of this is dramatic. None of this makes it into any retirement planning conversation. None of this is on any spreadsheet. And none of it transfers. That is the thing. That is the specific thing that the relocation decision almost never accounts for. The friendships transfer, theoretically. You can text the people you love from anywhere. The family relationships transfer. You can visit, you can call, you can Zoom on Sunday afternoons. But the social infrastructure, the ambient human familiarity of a place you have lived for decades, the unremarkable daily sense of being embedded in a world that knows you exist, that does not transfer. That has to be rebuilt from nothing. And rebuilding it, it turns out, is much harder at 65 than it was at 32, and much harder than anyone warned you it would be. And it takes much longer than anyone told you to expect. Diane figured this out. She's still in the Carolinas. She didn't move back. But when I talked to her 2 years after that "it's fine" phone call, the conversation was different. She said something I've thought about many times since. She said, "I think I confused the place with the life. I thought if the place was right, the life would follow. It doesn't work that way. The life has to be built. The place is almost beside the point." I want to stay with that for a moment, because it points to something that I think is the actual heart of why the relocation mistake happens, and why it happens to careful, intelligent people who did everything right. The retirement move, at its deepest level, is almost always about more than location. It is almost always a displacement of something else, a hope, a fear, a need, onto geography. If we can just get to the right place, the thinking goes, then the retirement we imagined will become available to us. The warmth, the slower pace, the new chapter. The geography carries the weight of the expectation. And when you arrive and the expectation is still there, unfulfilled, sitting with you in the perfectly acceptable kitchen of the perfectly acceptable house, that is when the quiet starts. I need to tell you about a couple I know from Tom's golf group. He is not going to love being in this video, but he also reads very little that I write, so I think we're safe. This man, I'll call him Richard, had been planning the Florida move for years. He had a map. He had a neighborhood picked out. He had talked about it at every gathering for 5 years, the way some people talk about a dream that you know they will actually pursue. Richard retired and they moved, and 14 months later they were back in Ohio. I asked him once, after he'd had some time to get perspective on it, what happened? He thought about it for a long time before he answered. And then he said, "I think I needed it to be Florida's fault. For a long time I needed it to be that Florida was wrong, the neighborhood was wrong, the heat was too much, the people were different. And eventually I had to stop pretending that and admit that it wasn't about Florida. Florida was fine. I just hadn't figured out who I was going to be without the job, and I thought Florida would help with that. and it didn't. Nothing geographical was ever going to help with that. Richard and his wife moved back into the same neighborhood they'd left. I don't know if that was the right answer for them, but I know that admitting it was one of the hardest things Richard had done in a long time, because he is a proud man, and he had been very certain about Florida, and certainty is expensive to abandon. There is a particular kind of courage involved in saying out loud, "The move was a mistake." I have watched people struggle to find that courage, and I want to spend a moment on why it is so difficult, because I think it is more complicated than it looks. When you have sold the house you lived in for 30 years, the house where your children grew up, where you know which stair creaks, where the light in the kitchen at 7 in the morning has been the same light you've looked at for decades, and you have moved your belongings across the country, and you have changed your address, and you have notified everyone you know, and you have told a story to everyone in your life about a new beginning, a fresh chapter, a bold and intentional retirement move. The pressure to make that story true is enormous. Not because you are weak, because you are human, because the mind does not easily absorb the idea that a large, careful, well-reasoned decision was wrong. The sunk cost whispers at you every single day. You moved. You chose this. What would it mean if you were wrong? What I saw in the couples who got stuck was that they turned the internal question outward. Instead of sitting with, "I think this move was a mistake," they generated an endless list of external grievances. The neighbors were unfriendly. The restaurants were mediocre. The driving was aggressive. The heat was genuinely too much. All of these things may have been true. None of them were the point. The point was the question underneath, the one nobody wanted to ask directly, which was, did we solve the right problem? The couples who found their way through, and some of them stayed in the new place, and some of them went back, and some of them went somewhere different entirely, were the ones who were eventually able to sit across from each other and say, "I'm not sure this is working." Not to accuse, not to assign blame, just to say it, just to let the other person stop carrying it alone. That is the thing about a relocation mistake that makes it genuinely different from other retirement mistakes. It is a shared mistake. You went together. And when it isn't working, you are not working in the same unfamiliar space. And you cannot debrief with your friends because your friends are somewhere else. And you cannot go for a walk and run into someone who knows you. And you are each carrying the same unspoken question, and you are carrying it alone, because saying it out loud would mean making the other person carry it too. So instead you talk about the neighbors and the restaurants and the heat. I know this from women who told me this months or years later when the acute part was over. I know it from Diane. I know it from a woman in my professional network. She and her husband had moved to be closer to their grandchildren, which sounds like the most reasonable retirement reason there is, and discovered that being embedded in their adult child's life at such close range was a different kind of discomfort, and they had to have a very different conversation than they expected. I know it from the specific quality of the "it's fine" that I have heard more than once from more than one person in the months after a retirement move. I want you to stop for a moment. I want you to really stop, because what I have been describing is not a story about bad decisions or foolish people. Every single person I've mentioned, Diane, Richard, the woman who moved to be near the grandchildren. These are capable, thoughtful people who made deliberate choices. The problem was not the quality of the thinking. The problem was the question the thinking was trying to answer. The question they were trying to answer was, where should we live? The question they actually needed to answer was, who do we want to be? You cannot relocate your way out of a question that travels with you. That is what I've come to understand. That is the thing I couldn't see clearly until I had watched it happen enough times and thought about it long enough and had my own version of the cereal aisle moment. Not from a move, Tom and I never made the move, but from enough related moments of dislocation in the first years of retirement to understand what it feels like when the geography shifts and the self hasn't caught up yet. The retirement move, when it goes wrong, is not primarily a geographical error. It is a philosophical one. It is the belief, usually unexamined, that the problem with the current life is the setting, and that a different setting will produce a different life. But the life doesn't live in the setting. The life lives in you, and you get in the moving truck too. What the couples who navigate this well have in common is not that they made the right geographical decision. It's that they were eventually willing to separate the question of where from the question of who. To ask, independent of where we are, what does a meaningful retirement actually look like for us? What do we need, not from a location, but from a life? And then, does the place we're in make that easier or harder? Not does the place match the brochure. Does the place serve the life? That is a different question. It gets to different answers. Here is what I want to say to you directly, and I mean this. If you have made the move and something is quietly wrong, if you have been performing fine for months, if you are spending more time finding fault with the place than discovering it, if your spouse has a look that you recognize and neither of you has named what it is, I want to offer you something, not advice. I am genuinely not in a position to tell you what to do. But I can offer you this. The fact that the move was a mistake is not a referendum on your intelligence, your judgment, or your marriage. It is information. Information is useful. Information acted on is much more useful than the performance of fine. The challenge, and I mean this as a gift, not as a judgment, is to say it out loud. To the person you moved with, not to problem solve, not to decide, not yet, what to do about it. Just to say, I don't think this is working the way we imagined. And to let that be said and received before you decide anything else. Because here is what I have seen. The couples who can say that to each other, who can sit with the discomfort of a wrong decision without immediately needing to fix it or defend it or assign fault, those are the couples who find their way through. They may stay, they may go back, they may do something else entirely, but they do it together with honest information rather than in parallel performances of inadequacy that neither of them actually feels. That is the accountability, not to a place, to each other, and to the truth of what is actually happening, whatever that truth turns out to be. I want to know one thing from you. If you have moved for retirement, whether it worked, whether it didn't, whether you're still in the middle of figuring it out, I want you to write in the comments the one thing you didn't know you'd miss until it was gone. Not the big obvious things, not the friends, not the family, the small things, the things that weren't on any list, the specific, unremarkable texture of a life lived somewhere long enough to belong to it, the thing you only knew you had by its absence. Write it down. I read every single comment on this channel, and the ones that have stayed with me longest are never the ones about the grand decisions. They are always the ones about the cereal aisle, the stair that creaks, the pharmacist who knew the last name. If what you heard today felt true to something you have been carrying, quietly because it's embarrassing, because you chose this, I want you to subscribe. Not for the numbers, though I notice them, because the comments on this channel have become genuinely some of the most honest conversations I have about what this stage of life actually feels like. Hit the bell. These conversations are worth continuing. The move may have been wrong. That is survivable. What is harder to survive is the performance of fine, extended indefinitely, while the honest version of your life waits in a parking lot you haven't found yet. Take care of yourselves, and be honest with the person you're doing this with. It is the only thing that actually helps.